Hi, I'm Joe Carrero. I just can't believe all these so-called liberals and conservatives getting people to buy into their arguments about the effects of big oil, high gas prices, subsidies, and all the other propaganda that they want us to believe about our current economic crisis. It's once again big corporations and big government playing us against ourselves, with political parties getting us to do their bidding. And per usual, there are two sides to every story, with the truth hidden in between, as both sides blame each other, preventing a resolution to the problem. You do know that they actually plan it that way. As a former state senator for 20 years, an executive committee member of the National Energy Council, an energy consultant, a stockbroker, and a financial analyst, let me please help you interpret all the doublespeak and misinformation without the burden of having to defend either side. First of all, the oil companies do not receive subsidies that are paid out from the U.S. Treasury. They receive tax breaks, or earnings that they get to keep that they never make to the government, and amount to about $4.5 billion per year. Of course, ethanol gets $6 billion in subsidies. It's mandated by law, protected by tariffs. Companies are paid by the federal government to use it, and it's mixed with the gas whose price keeps going up. Now, to those of us average Joes and Janes, oil is a necessity. We don't have to buy a new car or furniture or solar panels or any of the myriad of other products that we don't need to live every day. But for most of us, we need gas to get somewhere, chances are to work, to help pay our bills. And we also have to pay the freight for all those other goods and services that require gas for transportation to our grocery stores and other businesses that eventually add on the increases of gas to their products. So when we hear about the arguments pro and con about how much the oil companies contribute to society, or how much they made, or how much in tax breaks they received, let's also take into account they have a captured clientele for their product. We need it no matter what it costs us. But why does it cost so much? Well, it's really the perception of supply and demand that are in fact the cause of high prices. It's what those involved in the supply chain that think that they can get for it, given what those who need it are capable of spending. Whether it's the owners of the oil, the industries that extract and refine it, the governments who tax it, or the investors who buy it, somehow they all combine to figure out how much the end user can stand to pay for it. Keep in mind that 95% of the world's oil supply is under the control of countries, and only about 5% of the world's oil resources is owned by big oil, even though they have operating contracts with these other governments, such as those belonging to OPEC. Now, surprisingly to a lot of folks, the largest producers of oil are Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the United States, with the Saudis exporting more than any other country, with us, of course, with the most demand importing the most oil. Interestingly, in the top 10 producers are our two neighbors, Canada and Mexico, which both sell us a lot of oil, and a major beneficiary of our financial and military largesse, Iraq. Many years ago, I passed legislation requesting that the White House arrange a deal with Iraq that eventually pays us back in oil for all the money we have spent liberating that country. Now that would bring down the price of gas. Unfortunately, President Bush didn't like the idea. So it's the causes of our increasing demand for supply from other countries are the driving forces behind what we have to pay for oil. And as our country does nothing to increase the supply at home, we are faced with increasing imports setting the prices. It really doesn't help to have President Obama going to Brazil, paying them to increase their supply so we can pay them again for our demand. Rather, he should go to those oil exporting nations that we support and defend with our tax dollars, and balance the needs and demands of our nations by telling them to cut the price of oil to us by producing more, since the recent higher costs have been driven by the unrest in Libya and other oil-producing Middle East countries, along with a rising energy demand from countries like India and China, who haven't offered the oil-producing world much in the way of support. Of course, even if the supply of oil is plentiful, there is a potential bottleneck for the supply of gasoline and the capacity of our oil refineries to make it. Gas prices have risen in the United States in part because of a sudden spike in demand for gas that could not be met by our refining facilities, of which many are owned by big oil, who also then profit when the price of gas goes up. And I think one of the last refineries that was built, it was in 1976. So it's been a while. Of course, the fewer refineries there are, the higher the cost of gas following the limitation of supply, driving the cost of demand and increasing profits. Oil is also traded on commodities markets and is therefore subject to speculation, as we've heard. If the traders think the price of oil will continue to rise, they'll drive the price up regardless of the real supply or demand. And another non-direct global market force that causes gas prices to go up is foreign currency trading and inflation. If the value of our country's currency goes down, the same amount of money buys less oil on the international market, driving up the price of our gas. Other components of our oil pricing are the taxes. Federal and state governments receive money based on the price of oil, so their oil revenues increase because you're spending more on gas, meaning your disposable income decreases and you have less money to spend on food, prescription drugs, mortgages, insurance, and other necessities, as well as other goods and services that you would normally purchase. What governments don't realize is that when consumers pay more for gas, they spend less on gross receipts taxes, and the economy suffers when there's no longer a multiplier effect from consumer spending, with all that money taken out of the economy and going instead directly to multinational oil companies and the government. So unlike other kinds of consumer spending, gasoline prices provide less benefit for the U.S. economy. Now, combined federal and state gas taxes range from a high of about 66 cents in California to 26 cents in Alaska. And oil and gas companies generally pay our governments between 12 and 17% royalties for lease to drill on public land or water. Although I've seen the corruption in oil exporting countries, where oil companies only paid a small percentage of the typical royalty by bribing government officials, meaning less money for the country, but larger profit for the oil companies. The debate in our country is whether big oil makes too much profit globally to warrant our country's taxpayers to give them tax breaks. And as Congress has continually balked at raising royalties or repealing tax breaks, I remember being in Alaska for Energy Council meetings when Governor Sarah Palin raised taxes on oil companies, giving each Alaskan another $1,200 to help cover the cost of gas. I was even there before during her campaign against fellow Republican then Governor Frank Murkowski, that she won by pointing out that he was soft on oil companies and that someone had to take the people's side for a change. Well, the U.S. Senate certainly didn't take the people's side. It turned down repealing the tax breaks that big oil is receiving, even with their windfall profits. And at the hearing prior to the vote, the head of a major oil company stated that anyone who opposed the continuation of tax breaks to oil companies was un-American and threatened to take his corporation's business to another country. Is this sort of un-American attitude held by major corporations that has contributed to the demise of our economic system? And yet his position was supported not only by many Republican members of the Senate and the House, by citizens of our country who believe we must acquiesce to the welfare of these corporations under the fear of job losses and further eroding of our once invincible economic system. These oil companies are the ones assisting in the diminishment of our country's economic system by reaping tremendous profits at the cost of consumers who are unable to spend their money on anything else but the necessity of gas. Have you heard all those commercials on radio and TV with average Joes and Janes out there speaking out against taxing the oil companies? Why would anybody in their right mind stand up and defend these mega corporations while each one of us is paying our way out of the middle class status as these corporate giants rake in huge profits? These people are defending their own demise. And I've heard about how profits just look big because they're really big companies, and the tens of billions that they rake in equates to a small percentage if you compare them to other companies in other industries. Let me tell you, the five big oil companies, ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, Chevron, and ConocoPhillips, made $34 billion in profits the first 3 months of 2011, up 42% from a year ago. 42%. So I guess your pain is their gain. And while their business is global, that profit equates to $110 for every man, woman, and child in the United States in just 3 months, as you watch the price of gas go to $4 a gallon. Now, as a person educated and experienced in the world of energy, I can tell you that they're playing you and paying someone else to get you go over that cliff like a bunch of lemons. Now, the oil industry warns that repealing the subsidies or tax breaks, in addition to costing jobs, would lead to higher gas prices. Oh, really? Well, fuel costs are largely affected by the price of oil. And by the way, that price has little to do with how much it costs to produce it. Gas prices, though, shoot up when oil prices shoot up. And when oil prices shoot up for reasons that have nothing to do with how much it costs to bring it out of the ground, it's a windfall for those folks who produce it. Now, the average cost to produce a barrel of oil is about $30, with 1/3 going to extraction and taxes, and 2/3 going to exploration and development. And that's according to a U.S. Energy Information Administration survey, even though oil companies say it'll cost them $60. The going rate to buy a barrel of oil today is about $110. That's $110 for $30. That's a nice profit when you're dealing with a necessity that doesn't require constant improvement to its product or marketing to even sell it. And every visit to the gas pump reflects a transfer of money from the many who have to have it to the few who are selling it. And in most cases, from the not-so-rich to the super-rich. Now, whenever somebody mentions that, somebody brings up the word socialism. That someone else is the oil company executive making tens of millions of dollars a year, or somebody sympathetic to their plight. Now, is it right for people who take risks in business to get rich? Yes, of course. But these multinational oil companies' profits are not finding their way back into the communities from which they came, and are not being used to create more jobs, and are not being invested in new equipment and exploration. So why do they deserve a tax break and you don't? And what are they doing with all this profit? Well, some of the money is going back out the door in the form of large dividends to stockholders, which is fair. In the case of two of the big five, Exxon and ConocoPhillips, more than half of the total profits are being used to buy back their own stock. Over $5.5 billion of Exxon's profits went to buy back its own stock, and the company announced that it expects to buy back yet another $5 billion in the second quarter of this year. Now, why shouldn't these companies be able to spend their profits any way they want? Well, you see, buying back stock sends stock prices up by boosting earnings per decreasing outstanding shares, increasing the demand for the stock. If you're one of the few tax-paying Americans that owns a bunch of oil stock, it's a good thing. And if you're an oil executive who gets stock option bonuses, the higher the stock price goes, the more valuable the option. Also, an increase in the stock price is not taxed until the stock is sold, and only then at a capital gains tax rate, which is limited to 15%. A phenomenal deal to these wealthy executives and board members and shareholders paying income tax at the highest marginal rate of 35%, to now only have to pay 15%. These profits, which include tax breaks, translate into a whole lot of money for these managers that they will lie and fight to the death to keep, thanks to the generosity of us taxpayers through the decisions of our government. You see, it's all politics, with a coalition of Republicans and Democrats conning people to believe tax breaks are the American thing to do. Having the taxpayers pay more taxes so that managers of corporations can make more money sounds to me like the corporations are running this country. Oh, another thing this industry does with all its cash is buy influence in Washington. oil and gas companies spent $40 million lobbying Congress in just the first quarter of this year and have donated nearly $18 million directly to the political campaigns of senators who voted against ending these tax breaks. Just as our government has given tax breaks to industries during their tough times, we need to recoup these losses during their good times. Of course, we need to achieve a better balance between industry and government in this case by removing the moratorium on drilling in the Gulf of Mexico and immediately begin granting environmentally sound drilling permits to not only eventually remove ourselves from the grip of foreign oil, but to increase our revenues from enhanced conditions from the oil industry after the removal of these tax breaks. That will also increase employment since our oil field workers are unable to work today because they can't receive drilling permits or leases that are not being made available. You see, the battle over tax breaks doesn't really have the effect on oil prices that the oil companies want you to believe and many consumers think it will. But it will certainly help bring down the deficit. Of course, those in the oil industry, along with their supporters in Congress, also argue that compared to the deficit, that these tax breaks are just a drop in the bucket. And that's why we need to examine all the tax breaks and subsidies that have been passed by Congress and eliminate those that don't offer an immediate stimulation to our economy. But let's not forget that particular drop in the bucket is from a profit, from a necessity that's worth $110 to every person in the United States. Can you imagine the impact on our economy if Congress had the guts and integrity to relieve our taxpayers of those tax breaks and subsidies that enable these corporations to gain such huge profits, thus allowing our economic system to thrive? Of course, we know that's not going to happen, because those claiming to be conservatives have forgotten their goal of limiting government burdens on the taxpayer, which is in direct conflict with burdening the taxpayer at the enrichment of corporations. And then, of course, you have consumers continuing to defend their own demise by agreeing with Congress that a necessity can be priced without regard to what it costs, even though profits are being enhanced by a government action in violation of a constitution created to protect and enhance the life and expectations of the individual. This corporate governance that now controls our Congress will not only drive each one of us into the poorhouse, but will financially and morally bankrupt our country. And the way they'll continue to do that is to get more people on the side of big government that exists to enrich big corporations. With the way we've allowed our political system to work, without considering the relationship between the cause of the individual and the welfare of the country, we're not that far away from granting stipends and gas stamps to those who are barely making it, since they can no longer pay the price of gas to get to work. Guess who's going to pay for that? And how quickly do you think it'll be before the system turns as corrupt as Medicare? And how long do you think it'll be before the middle class disappears? Then there will be a real justification to complain about socialism. We better wake up, America, because the worst is yet to come. And thanks for listening to An Average Joe.